All right, welcome to the endocrine system. Hopefully, this first screencast will be a little bit shorter because chapter 14 was very long. Um, just quick overview. You may recall from Anatomy and Physiology 1 that an endocrine gland is a gland that does not have a duct. So, your endocrine system works by glands that dump hormones into extracellular fluid that then ends up in the bloodstream. So what's missing from the picture here is your circulatory system. That is what makes sure that hormones get from point A to point B. And a hormone is just defined here as anything that travels in the blood or lymph. I am not going to ask you about the definition of a hormone because it is something that gets rather tricky to define. So there are lots of chemicals that end up in the bloodstream that don't necessarily come from endocrine glands, but we don't always consider them hormones. So I don't really worry so much about what the definition of a hormone is, as long as you know that these things that we call hormones end up in the bloodstream, travel everywhere, and do lots of cool things. This list is not super duper important, but it is a good overview of all the different things that hormones can do. So they have very powerful effects on the body, some of which are short term, some of which are very long term. Number one, if you think about that, that's really just hormones acting like neurotransmitters. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, when they get released into the bloodstream, can cause cardiac tissue to depolarize or hyperpolarize. So that's what that one is about. Number two, altering gene expression. I don't know if your Anatomy and Physiology 1 used that term, gene expression, but that refers to turning genes on and off, or instructing the cell to refer to a gene in the DNA and use that gene to make more protein. So what that really is doing is driving cellular function and driving development, because what makes a muscle different from a neuron is the genes that it expresses. So if you can control gene expression, you can drive development, and that's one of the things that hormones do. So think about the development of all your secondary sex characteristics that happen when your sex hormone levels go up. And even a lot of the anatomical differences between males and females is driven by alterations in gene expression. Activating and deactivating enzyme systems. For this, just think like regulating blood sugar. And I won't go into too much detail about that. Inducing secretory activity. This just refers to the fact that some hormones can cause other hormones to be secreted, like your pituitary releases regulatory hormones that control a lot of your other endocrine glands. And stimulating mitosis is just, that's directing growth, right? Mitosis is cells dividing. So if you can stimulate mitosis, then you're changing growth. That kind of goes hand in hand with number two. If you're altering gene expression and stimulating mitosis, then you're affecting the growth and development of an organism. So these are big, long-term, permanent effects that hormones have. Hormones can be divided into two structural classes. I don't really care about them so much. You're going to see that it's the functional classes that are more important, but it's nice to understand things. So you have this broad class of amino acid based hormones, which means it can be something as simple as an amino acid or a single amino acid that has been modified, like norepinephrine, to act like a hormone. It can be a very short chain of amino acids. So here's 9 amino acids strung together to make oxytocin. Or it can be a great big long chain of amino acids, which we call a protein or a peptide. This is growth hormone that you have here. So those three all get lumped into the same class, and they have a lot of functional characteristics in common. Then you have this other class of steroid hormones, which is everything that's derived from cholesterol. And so when you say steroid, don't think performance enhancing drugs, athletes take steroids. That's just one steroid like testosterone and other anabolic steroids. But progesterone, cortisol, which regulates blood sugar levels, and aldosterone, which regulates your sodium levels, all of those are derived from cholesterol, so they're considered steroids. What is more important are the functional classes. So what we care about is whether or not a hormone is water soluble or water insoluble. And they largely coincide with the structural class, except for thyroid hormone, which is derived from an amino acid but is hydrophobic, so it is considered water insoluble. This is coming up here, one of your possible open-ended questions on the exam. So it would be either a question about water-soluble hormones or a question about water-insoluble hormones. And you want to know, the 3 bullet points that are here. You want to know how they function, why they function that way, and what that means. So, for instance, water-soluble hormones activate G-protein cell surface receptors. So they act on receptors that are on the surface of the cell because they cannot enter target cells. Right? If they are water-soluble, then they are polar and they can't cross the cell membrane to act directly on machinery inside the cell. And then the G-protein linked receptors can cause any of these 5 things to happen. You don't have to list all the 5 things. Just be able to say that a G-protein receptor can do anything that a hormone can do. And the way you want to think about them is like this skill tool that I have here, or like a Dremel multi-tool. They're very flexible cell signaling systems, where you have this tool here would be, in this analogy, the receptor, and you have one part of the receptor that's outside the cell, and then the box represents the cell, so the other end of the receptor that's inside the cell. This is sort of the power end. Right? And different cells can attach different things to the receptor. So you've got, I don't know what all this stuff is, sanding wheels and cutting discs and buffing pads and grinders and all of that stuff. So you can have different hormones turning on the receptor on the outside of the cell, and then depending on what's hooked up on the inside, you can get all of these different effects. I have included a couple extra slides. They don't contain information that you need to know. They're just examples. So here is a G-protein linked receptor. This would be some hormone, it doesn't matter which hormone, that would activate this receptor. And here we see that this particular cell has this enzyme PLC, that stands for phospholipase C. You don't need to know that. But here is the receptor, and this is all of the machinery it's going to activate after the hormone binds to it. Here is, where are we? Sorry. This is another G-protein linked receptor. This GPC, I think, stands for G-protein coupled receptor. In this cell, there's a different partner enzyme waiting in the cell membrane. This one happens to be adenylate cyclase, which is going to cause all different kinds of stuff to happen inside the cell. So you just want to think of the receptor as being this very flexible signaling system wherein your body can mix and match different downstream intracellular machinery with different kinds of receptors. It's really quite cool if you care to think about it. Next up then is water insoluble hormones. So this is your steroid hormones and thyroid hormone. As insoluble or water insoluble hormones, they are hydrophobic, so they can cross the cell membrane. So their receptors are intracellular, and those receptors then enter the nucleus, bind to DNA, and direct gene expression. So they can turn genes on, they can turn genes off. And this is one of the reasons why your reproductive hormones, your steroid hormones, are so powerful, because they direct gene expression, which is one of the big drivers of growth and development. So next up is this important concept, as it says right there, called target cell specificity. So basically, hormones are a lot like neurotransmitters, right? They only act if there's a receptor for them to bind to, and it is the receptors that determine the function of the hormone. So hormones can get dumped into your bloodstream. They travel everywhere. They have the potential to cause big changes in tissues, but their effects are regulated because only tissues that are expressing the receptor are going to respond to the hormone. So it's kind of like the way radio works, where a radio station broadcasts the signal, it's everywhere in the air around you. Or like your cell signals, right? You can't hear what other people are saying on their cell phones unless you have your cell phone, which is going to pick up the cell signal. Same thing with hormones. They go everywhere, but they only affect the cells that have receptors for them. And there can be more than one receptor type for a given hormone, so the same hormone can have different effects in different tissues. Like epinephrine, we consider a hormone because it gets dumped into the bloodstream, and you may remember from Anatomy and Physiology 1 that it regulates your fight or flight responses. So that same hormone is going to stimulate your, I can't speak today, it is going to cause vasodilation in peripheral blood vessels so that your skeletal muscle gets lots of blood, and vasoconstriction in visceral blood vessels, so it's shutting down blood flow to the digestive organs and increasing blood flow to the skeletal muscle. So the same hormone can have different effects in different tissues because there are multiple hormones. Let's see. Here is a list I will try to get through quickly without too many examples, but you do want to commit these terms to memory, and I will try and refer back to this list when we talk about the individual hormones, give you examples. Permissiveness is one that we're not going to see a lot of examples of. It says one hormone cannot exert its effects without another hormone being present. The best example of that I know of is the relationship between progesterone and estrogen. So one of the effects of progesterone on certain tissues is the expression of estrogen receptors. So some tissues will not be responsive to estrogen unless they've first been exposed to progesterone. That's an example of permissiveness. Synergism is a little bit easier to understand. It's just two hormones that kind of do the same thing. Right, so there's a hormone called growth hormone that makes you grow. We all know that if you take certain steroid hormones, that makes your muscles get bigger too. That's synergism. So when you get an increase in growth hormone and an increase in the sex hormones that cause growth, you get big gains in growth during puberty. Antagonism, this you're familiar with already. Just cast your mind back to the skeletal system and remember the two hormones that affect calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone elevates blood calcium levels. Calcitonin lowers blood calcium levels. So they're two hormones that have opposite reactions or opposite actions on the body. Sorry, I'll slow down a little. This list also not hugely important, but it's a good overview. So there are at least 3 different ways that a hormone can be stimulated to be released, or 3 different control mechanisms. So with humoral stimuli, that just means something floating around in your bloodstream or extracellular fluid that is not a hormone that your body tracks and is used to regulate hormone levels. Like calcium in the bloodstream affects parathyroid hormone, or parathyroid hormone and calcitonin monitor calcium levels and then are released in response. or your pancreas tracks blood sugar levels and then releases either insulin or glucagon in response to changes in blood sugar levels. Neural stimuli just means that your nervous system causes a hormone to be released. As far as I know, the only example of this is the adrenal medulla, which if you had me for Anatomy and Physiology 1, I go on and on about how cool the adrenal gland is, but we won't do that now. Then last up is hormonal stimuli. The best example of this is the pituitary gland, which is sometimes referred to as your master endocrine gland. In this picture here, you have TSH coming out of the pituitary. This is thyroid stimulating hormone. It will get dumped into the bloodstream, travel everywhere. When it hits the thyroid gland, it stimulates the thyroid to release thyroid hormone. So a lot of what hormones do is actually regulate the release of other hormones, and we end up with these big feedback loops that we'll talk about next week. So this then brings us to the pituitary. So I've moved the slides around a little bit because they weren't in the order that I actually like them to be. So it's all the same information, all the same slides, just in a slightly different order. I apologize for messing with my lecture. We're talking about the relationship between the pituitary and the hypothalamus. I want to start by first just thinking about the pituitary, and then we'll refer back to the hypothalamus. And all of this information is on other slides. So first is the pituitary. It is divided into two sections or two parts, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. They are different embryonic derivatives. It's another interesting developmental thing, like the adrenal gland. So the anterior pituitary is traditional endocrine tissue. It is a gland. The posterior pituitary is actually an outgrowth of the hypothalamus. So it is developmentally and anatomically, if you look at it with a microscope, it is neural tissue. And it is the hypothalamus here that controls the release of hormones. And when we talk about the two individual lobes, anterior and posterior, how the hypothalamus regulates the release of the pituitary hormones will become clearer. So we are going to start first by talking about the posterior pituitary and its relationship to the hypothalamus. So as I said before, it is actually an extension of the hypothalamus. So if you look down at the posterior pituitary, these are axon terminals, and if you follow the axons back, you end up at nuclei, or little collections of cell bodies in the hypothalamus. So the posterior pituitary is really just the exit port for the hypothalamus, and you have neurons in the hypothalamus that monitor humoral and other stimuli in the body and then release hormones through the posterior pituitary when they are called for. So it's really just an extension of the posterior pituitary. There are two hormones that we're going to talk about. OT is oxytocin, and ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. First up is oxytocin, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on. It has two effects that I want you to know, and they're both linked because they're regulated to smooth muscle. So the first is it is what stimulates uterine contractions during childbirth. You may remember it as an example of a positive feedback loop where oxytocin causes a contraction. The contraction dilates the cervix, which then causes more oxytocin release. The other effect that I want you to know is that is what triggers milk ejection, or what's called the letdown reflex during suckling. This is not milk production. The milk is already there. That is under the control of a different hormone. But what this does is cause contractions in the mammillary ducts, the smooth muscle in the mammillary ducts, that actually propels the milk a little bit to make suckling easier. It has a lot of other cool effects that we just don't have time to go into, so I will not waste your time talking about them. Then we have antidiuretic hormone, which has a pseudonym called vasopressin. The reason why it has two names, backstory, is that there were two different research groups working on this chemical that they had purified from the bloodstream that had these different effects. And one group called it antidiuretic hormone because of its effects on the kidney, and another group called it vasopressin because they were studying the vasculature. And then sometime after they both published, people realized that they were talking about the same molecule. It just had these two different effects, an antidiuretic effect and a vasopressor effect. So you have cells in your hypothalamus that monitor the osmolarity of your bloodstream, or the solute content of your bloodstream. If your osmolarity gets too high, meaning you've got a lot of solute, so conversely not enough water, your blood is not dilute enough, it's too concentrated, that is going to cause these hypothalamic neurons to release antidiuretic hormone, and antidiuretic hormone targets the kidneys and causes the kidneys to concentrate your urine more, so you're retaining more water, and that reduces your urinary output. So urination is sometimes called diuresis. This antidiuretic effect is holding on to as much of your blood volume as possible because your blood pressure is starting to drop. At the same time, the same hormone can stimulate vasoconstriction in your blood vessels so that the total volume available for your decreased blood goes down and it brings your blood pressure up. So really what antidiuretic hormone function is about maintaining blood pressure, because generally speaking, if your blood osmolarity is low, it means your blood volume is low because you're getting dehydrated. Either way, antidiuretic hormone maintains your blood pressure by reducing urinary output and causing vasoconstriction. And that's where the two names come from. Then we get to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Here things get a little bit more complicated. You have a blood vessel that connects the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. It's called the hypophyseal portal vein. What portal veins do is connect to capillary beds. So normally we think of arteries leading into capillaries, and then the vein drains the capillary and the blood goes away, like you have here an artery going in and here a vein coming out. But here you have this hypophyseal portal vein that's connecting capillaries from the hypothalamus to the capillary bed in your anterior pituitary. And this is one instance, the only instance, where hormones are actually directed to go to a specific tissue, because this portal vein connects your hypothalamus to your pituitary. So your hypothalamus releases regulatory hormones, which we will cover, that travel through the portal vein directly to the anterior pituitary, which then causes the secretion or regulates the secretion of a whole bunch of anterior pituitary hormones. These are your anterior pituitary hormones. This is also them, but overview of everything they do. So these are the hormones that we're talking about that come from the anterior pituitary. These are the regulatory hormones from the hypothalamus that control their release. And then we have what happens after these hormones get released. We are going to stop there, and we will pick up with prolactin next week or in the next screencast.